modern times they call the king of the Jews.
Yeah, that's wrong. That's wrong. That's a mistranslation because we're reading anachronistically Jews, which don't come on the scene until the 6th century, Common Era, back into the 1st century. We've been doing that for over a millennium. There are no Jews in the 1st century. There are the tree out of which Judaism grows and Christianity grows exists in the 1st century, and Islam too. That's a very interesting tree with many branches. So whenever you hear that mentioned, that's wrong. Just make a little note to yourself, that's wrong. Yeah, Rob.
I'll talk to you later.
Okay, brother, no problem. The fact that the author uses the term Judean to designate others suggests to some extent that the author of John himself may have been a Galilean. That may be true. In Syro-Palestine, the common in-group name for members was for people who belonged to the house of Israel, was Israel. But how could you, if you were an Israelite living in Syro-Palestine, Jan, how would you distinguish yourself from another Israelite? Well, where are you from? Are you from Judea? Therefore, we can know for sure you're okay. Or are you a Galilean? Maybe a half-breed. Too close to Samaria. Or a Perean, you live in the Transjordan area. So when members of this in-group, Jan, sought to distance their own group from others inside the circle of Israel, the distinction between Judea, Galilee, and Perea come into play. That make sense? However, the common outgroup name for the house of Israel was simply Judeans. Perhaps largely due to the presence of the temple of the God of Israel in Judea, along with the priesthood and traditional kingship there. Since Judean was not normally the way inhabitants of that geographical area referred to themselves, they were Israelites, but rather the way outsiders to Syro-Palestine referred to them, the most we can say for certain is that by using this term for his opponents, John strongly asserts that the Johannine Jesus group has an outsider status in relationship to his anti-society, Israel. He and his group are not Judeans, but those who are in opposition to the Johannine Jesus group are Judeans. That's important. As we've noted at length in our introductions to this gospel, anti-societies are especially inclined to develop in-group languages all their own. They use ordinary terms for the ordinary language of the larger society, but give them special in-group meanings that are understood only by insiders. Anti-language uses vocabulary common to the whole greater society. John, in other words, uses Greek koine words, but the meanings that his community gives those words are very special, different, and even bizarre compared to outside the anti-society. People using those same words, different meanings. Given the conflictual and anti-societal character of John's community, we are not surprised to find in the gospel extremely high context communication in an anti-societal key. This in-group language, or anti-language, derives its peculiar meaning from the social context of John's anti-society. It is important to understand, folks, exactly what anti-language is. Anti-language derives from an anti-society that is set up within another society as a conscious alternative to it. A genuine anti-language, as opposed to simple slang or idiom, is the product of a dissatisfied group. It is not mere affectation or literary flair. Anti-language lives only among the genuinely estranged who are in conflict with the values of the society in which they live. An anti-society, along with its anti-language, is an alternate society rooted in a form of social conflict carried on by dissociated persons living in a hollowed-out social sphere within the dominant social order. Unlike Mark, Matthew, and Luke, John's community were misfits. The gospel called John has the main characteristics of anti-language. Heavy over-lexicalization, many words for the same reality or concern to the group. John's got too many words to say the same thing. That is a light going ding, 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 anti-language, anti-society. How do we know this? Because you all ask me, how do you know this? Well, this is how scholars figure it out. New oppositional terminology for the in-group and its concerns. That means the words used by the main society in a very different way. The same vocabulary, but radically new, specialized meanings, unusual meanings. Emphasis on the interpersonal. Interpersonal relationships between the author and group members, and interpersonal relationships between Jesus and group members, and interpersonal relationship between God and the group members. And social contrasts with the outgroup, which is the dominant society, in this case Israel. All of these features play heavily in John. How do we know? How do we know? How do we know? I'm showing you how we know. An anti-society is a social structure based on interpersonal relationships. Please listen to this on this slide. An anti-society is a social structure based on interpersonal relationships, on persons and their significance, on mutual trust and group loyalty. Folks, anti-societies are not societies based on truths. That means the Gospel of John is not a gospel trying to get you to buy a bunch of truths. It is little concerned with ideological propositions or statements of doctrine. The main question involved in Johannine anti-language is not, what do we believe? But rather, how does this vocabulary and its reference facilitate my interpersonal bonding? Consider the Johannine contrast, which I have handed out to you on your paper, and its in-group dimensions versus out-group dimensions. The in-group dimensions are light, born of water or spirit, above, spirit, life, truth, sky vault, God, true or genuine or authentic Israelite, and not of this world. Notice the parallels and contrast with the out-group dimensions. Darkness, born of blood, flesh, humans. Below, flesh, death, lie, land, Satan, Judeans. This world equals Israelite society. The in-group is made up of light. The out-group is made of darkness. The in-group is born of water and spirit. The out-group is born of the mixing of bloods, or sexual desire, or the will to have an heir. The in-group is born from above. The out-group is born from below. The in-group has the spirit. The out-group is only flesh. The in-group has life. The out-group only death, full of death. The in-group has the truth. The out-group has a lie. The in-group has the sky vault, comes from sky vault. The out-group has only the land, and they can't even understand that. The in-group is from God. The out-group has only Satan. The in-group is the true Israelite. The out-group are the Judeans. The in-group is not of this world. The out-group is of this world, which means Israelite society. As anti-language vocabulary, all of these words, all of the words there in the two columns, look at those words. They're all found in Mediterranean Greek in the first century. All of the Jesus groups would have known these words. But the other Jesus groups, like Paul's, would have used these words in a way that Israelites of the era would have used them. But John uses these words in a very different way. He gives the same vocabulary, very different, new, specialized meanings. As anti-language vocabulary, all of these words take on an in-group or out-group specific, interpersonal qualities. Each of these words in John's usage refers to persons in their in-group or out-group dimensions. Thus, in-group members have hearts full of light. They have been born of God's authority power and are spirit-filled, really alive, truthful, and open to God. They are also experiencing the sky vault dimensions of Jesus' celestial activity. They experience Him regularly and routinely in alternate states of consciousness experiences. The in-group are Israelites, but they are not of Israelite society. Members of the out-group, on the other hand, have hearts full of darkness. They have been born of human desire, or the mixing of bloods, or the will of a male to have an heir. They are simply human. For all practical purposes, the out-group people are already dead. They speak only falsehoods, and can you blame them? That's all they can speak. They are tied to earthly experiences, they are deceived by Satan, and they succumb to his loyalty tests. They are Judeans, devoted to the social symbols located in Judea, Jerusalem and its temple, forming Israelite society at large. In John's Gospel, Jesus' behavior and that of his in-group always manifest the dimensions that derive from the attitudes and behavior of those not of this world. That is to say, not of Israelite society as it is constituted. On the other hand, all opponents of Jesus and his in-group, the Johannine Jesus group, have all the features of Israelite society in general, or of Judeans in particular. As expressed in anti-language, these in-group, out-group dimensions underscore horizontal boundaries, social boundaries. But those in the know, those people who have the light, those members of the teknatheu, the children of God, that is to say, John's Jesus group, can flip those horizontal boundaries on their vertical side with in-group on top, and get to realize where this in-group really has its moorings, in the above, in sky vault with God, and the one whom He sent, Jesus, the true Son of God and Son of Man. In sum, the social function of anti-language and its in-group and out-group labels is to support and cement relationships within the in-group. This document called John is for insiders. It was never written for people outside the Johannine Jesus group. It was never written to be handed out to people on the street to convince them of doctrinal truths. It's not about doctrines. It's not about truths. It's about relationships, establishing and cementing ever further relationships inside the Jesus group. And that's what that image I keep showing you is all about. That's what the teknatheu, the children of God, are all about. Such group attachment in the anti-introspective ancient Mediterranean is called agape, love. But it's not the Hallmark card sentimentality you and I know about love. It's not the feeling you get at the end of a perfect Disney vacation. This kind of love means in-group glue, the basic requirement of Jesus in this gospel. The author thus expresses the in-group dimensions of social interrelationship in terms of a reciprocal love, in-group glue, that both establishes and cements the interpersonal bonding. Group attachment, in-group glue, love, in the Johannine sense of the word, enables Johannine members to experience the abiding presence of Jesus, notably through the Spirit or power of God via alternate states of consciousness. One more thing to mention before we move into our wonderful little banquet today. In the Gospel according to John, Jesus is again and again presented as a rabbi or as a teacher. The distinctive feature of John's story of Jesus, and this is something radically different than Jesus in Mark, Matthew, and Luke, the Synoptic Gospels, is that the Johannine Jesus does not proclaim a forthcoming theocracy. How strange. Because scholars tell us if there's one thing we can be certain of that the historical Jesus was all about, it was theocracy, the kingdom of God, the kingdom of Skyvault. Everything he said and all his healings are all about the theocracy, the kingdom of God, revitalizing Israel. Jesus was all about Israelite theocracy. And that's kind of how it is in the Synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke. Even though they too went through 3 stages of development, Mark, Matthew, and Luke preserve this very strongly from stage 1. You all get that? How strange then to encounter Jesus in John. The Johannine Jesus is not about theocracy. He doesn't go about proclaiming it. How interesting. How strange. Also, whereas Jesus is presented in the Synoptic Gospels as a folk healer, which is probably what Jesus was in stage 1, a folk healer that now we understand to be Messiah and cosmic Lord by the resurrection, now we realize in John, Jesus is a teacher. That's very different. In the Gospel of John, there is simply no talk about the kingdom of God or kingdom of Skyvault. In the Synoptic Gospels, we read of Jesus recruiting a faction of co-workers as apostles, emissaries, change agents to help him out with the political religious tasks of proclaiming the kingdom of God, theocracy. But in John, Jesus has persons seeking him out not to become his apostles, but to become his disciples. Do you understand this? In the Synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, they're not really his disciples. Because Jesus isn't a teacher in the Synoptic Gospels. Do you get this? In the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus isn't a teacher. He's a folk healer that we learn is the Messiah and cosmic Lord. So a Messiah and cosmic Lord needs followers, co-workers, emissaries, apostles. But in John, they're disciples. So what does that make Jesus in John? A teacher. You got it. See, apostles are persons sent with a commission. In the synoptic story, that commission is to help Jesus in his own task of revitalizing Israel by informing Israelites of the forthcoming theocracy and preparing people for it with healings and exorcisms. There is no mention of apostles in John, only of disciples. How radically different that is, huh? Disciples are followers of a teacher. They join up with a teacher in order to learn a way of life. This was the task of various philosophers of the Hellenistic world who sought to teach human beings how to live a meaningful human existence. Israel's scribes were rather similar, basing their instruction on distinctive appropriations of Israel's Torah. The Johannine Jesus as teacher would be perceived as such a scribe or philosopher, depending on who was assessing him. It is a distinctive feature of John that we are told nothing of Jesus' concern about a forthcoming theocracy. Instead, after introducing John the Dunker's witness about himself and about Jesus, which we'll look at next week, we are told that John the Dunker himself has disciples, in chapter 1, verse 35, who then seek out Jesus to know where he is staying, in chapter 1, verses 37 through 39. The only disciple of John the Dunker's that Jesus seeks out himself is Philip, who in turn invites Nathanael to come to Jesus. Similarly, Nicodemus, a teacher in Israel, seeks Jesus to find out more about him. Next, the Samaritans come to the Johannine Jesus at the Samaritan woman's invitation. In this cycle of events, beginning with the Johannine Jesus and his disciples in Cana in chapter 2, verse 1, and his return to Cana in chapter 4, verse 46, people seek out Jesus as teacher, representing a way of life that essentially consists in attachment to Jesus because of who he is and whom he reveals. While it is true that in John chapter 4, verse 47, and John chapter 11, verse 9, the Johannine Jesus is sought out as a healer, a folk healer, in chapter 12, verse 18 to 19, Greek-speaking Israelites seek him as a teacher also. Folks, Jesus and his disciples do not form a political faction in the gospel called John. That's not how it is in the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke. In Mark, Matthew, and Luke, they form a political faction, but not in John. In John, they form a collection of disciples. We are not told in John whether Jesus was ever bent on the revitalization of Israel, as we are told he was in the synoptic narratives. Rather, the Johannine Jesus sets forth a way of living focused on attachment to himself. A fictive kinship group, much like the group for whom John wrote his gospel. Fictive, not fictional. It's real, a real kinship group, but it's not biological. It's based on relationship with Jesus. Yes, Mary?
In the synoptics, is the word love mentioned very often or at all?
It is, and there also the idea is there it's what you owe your kin, which is in-group attachment. But for John, the commandment in John is to love one another as I have stuck to you, you must stick together. That's a better translation. In-group glue. And notice, it's not love outside that circle. It's stick together in this circle. That's very Johannine. That's very anti-society. Yeah. Folks, we can stop right there.